Mr. Jenkins, in a Gallup poll which will be published in tomorrow's Daily Telegraph, 75% of the country are shown to be in favour of hanging terrorists. Are you aware that Parliament's decision not to hang terrorists is perhaps deeply resented by the majority of people in this country?
It may be resented, I don't know. The figures you cite for the Gallup poll don't surprise me, and I don't think they would surprise nearly everybody who voted in the big majority against capital punishment for terrorists or for anybody else in the House of Commons yesterday. I think we were aware of this. This didn't for a moment mean that anybody who took part in that debate was contemptuous of public opinion. Nor, I think, did we feel out of sympathy with people's feelings. We understood them. And I think the great majority of those who voted in the majority would be perfectly happy to see terrorists hanged, bestial a process though it is, but terrorism is bestial, would be perfectly happy to see them hanged if we thought that it would have produced any greater safety, or perhaps even left the position neutral. But on deep consideration, we were convinced, on the evidence, on the past, on likely happenings in the future, that we would produce greater danger and not greater safety, that we would, in fact, be signing not warrants of safety, but warrants of danger for innocent people in the future. And believing that, I think this was an occasion when the House of Commons, deeply aware of public opinion, respectful of it, but also aware of its own duty to be representative, felt that it was right, if that was their view, to cast the vote as they did.
Did the fact that the House had already reflected public opinion, public outrage, by passing the legislation that it did, make MPs more ready to vote against the reintroduction of capital punishment for terrorists?
Well, you see, I think there was a great difference between the two, because the measures which I brought forward 2 weeks ago, tough measures, as I believe, to deal with the IRA, and I think they've been proving effective. I think they've helped the police a lot in the last 2 weeks. I think that those measures were not brought forward just as an expression of revulsion, though God knows we all felt revulsion about what had happened, but because we positively believed that they would help to improve the position and give us greater safety. There can't be, I'm afraid, any guarantee of absolute safety, but greater safety in the future. They weren't just an expression of revulsion. They were a logical attempt to try and do something to deal with the problem, and I believe they're working.
I'd like to come to those measures in a few minutes, Mr. Jenkins, but I'd just like to ask you, is the issue of hanging terrorists now out of the way once and for all? Or if, say, the violence does escalate, and if, for example, the provisional IRA were to start shooting policemen in this country, as they do in Northern Ireland, do you see the issue of executing terrorists being debated and voted on once again in the future?
Whenever the House wishes to do this, it can debate it. There are various ways in which it can do it. But, of course, the majority was decisive yesterday. And I think one reason why the majority was decisive was because the House on the whole thought that terrorists, really of all people, are the least susceptible to deterrence by hanging. The business of IRA terrorists is death. They trade upon it. And although I think it's assuming they're rational human beings, which they're not, it's not understanding their psychosis to believe that they'd be intimidated by the gallows. They love martyrs, and they would be happy to have martyrs. And I think another factor which arose here was that, as I told the House, it was the view, there's no unanimous police view, as there's no unanimous parliamentary view, no unanimous public view. But it's the view which he wanted me to express of the Commissioner of Police for London and of his nearly all his senior officers, those who are most directly engaged, that capital punishment would hinder and not help.
Do you think that the police have now broken the back of the IRA's campaign in Britain?
I think the police have done magnificently well, particularly in the last 2 weeks. I think it's early days to talk about breaking back, and I would not like to make any predictions for the future. We are engaged in a difficult struggle with some very dedicated and malevolent enemies. And this struggle may go on for some time, and I'm not going to pretend to anybody that it's over. There may be great difficulties to face in the future, but I think the progress which has been made in the past 2 weeks has been remarkable, and is a high tribute to those who, the police and those others who worked on it.
Say the violence does continue, and say your measures prove insufficient to curb terrorists in this country, IRA terrorists in this country, do you foresee a situation where soldiers may be used on the streets of London or Birmingham or Coventry just as they are in the streets of Belfast?
No, I don't foresee such a position. The position in this country is still, fortunately, very different from that which there has been in Northern Ireland. I want to improve the Northern Ireland situation, but until one can improve that, to keep the position different and give what protection one can in Great Britain. I think we are a long way off the position you've described. Of course, if the position goes on, if it gets worse, I will always consider and introduce as rapidly as possible, if, on the basis of the advice I get from the security services and other people, it is necessary, further measures. But what I want are measures which will work, and not gestures. I understand people sometimes want gestures, but what we want is to defeat this enemy of the IRA and not just indulge in gestures, which could make things worse.
So if it were decided, or if you were advised that it were necessary to put British soldiers on English streets, you would consider that? You would do that, in fact?
Well, I don't envisage this situation at all. But of course, I mean, any government would, if necessary, have soldiers on the streets rather than see the whole country dissolve into civil war. But what I'm doing, by taking the measures we are doing, is doing everything we can to prevent such a position. And as I say, the progress has been very good in the past 2 weeks. And I think, with respect, if one talks in these extreme terms, one is more likely to bring about, which I don't believe will happen, an extreme situation, and if one faces it resolutely but calmly.
Why was it necessary to push through Parliament a bill that has such enormous implications in such a short period of time? Did you and the House panic?
No, no. We didn't panic. The incident in Birmingham, which was the worst, the most dreadful incident, but was not, I suppose, different in kind. It was worse in quantity, but not different in kind from those which had happened at Guildford and the Tower of London, took place on a Thursday night. And I announced that I was looking at new measures on the Friday. I announced broadly what they would be on the Monday, and we then put them through Parliament in one very long sitting on the Thursday. They weren't rushed through in an atmosphere of hysteria. They were discussed carefully, but I put them through quickly, because although I think that these measures do involve certain interference with civil liberties which would not be desirable in normal circumstances, I thought, and the House thought, that they were justified in the circumstances that we were facing. And if they were justified, they should be put into operation as quickly as possible. And this is what we did and what Parliament did. No, it wasn't panic. It was rapid, determined action.
Why do you think it is, Mr. Jenkins, that when 21 people die in appalling circumstances in Birmingham, there is a sense of public outrage? And yet, over the past 5 years, when over 1,200 people have died in Northern Ireland, many of them in circumstances every bit as horrific as those of Birmingham, people just tend to shrug their shoulders. Why the difference?
I suppose there is a certain illogicality about this, and no one would minimize the horror of what's been happening in Northern Ireland for a number of years past. But in Northern Ireland, you have, alas, got into a position in which two communities have found it very difficult to live together without violence. That has not been the position in Great Britain, in Birmingham or any other city. The violence in Northern Ireland has been generated there, alas. The violence in Birmingham, London, in Guildford has been imported, and therefore there has been a different reaction to it for that purpose. Maybe not wholly justified, but in my view understandable.
Did what you saw in Birmingham in any way bring home Northern Ireland to you? I mean, I know that Northern Ireland has not been part of your brief over the past 9 months, but did you yourself become more aware or more horrified at what was happening, what is happening in Northern Ireland?
What I saw in Birmingham had a tremendous impact upon me, even though I'd seen the victims of the Tower explosion in hospital and the victims of the Guildford explosion in hospital. Birmingham was worse from this point of view. It was also, of course, a city immensely familiar to me, in which I'd just fought 2 election campaigns. And there was always something more striking about a horrific situation in a familiar against a familiar background and against a familiar one. I shall never forget that Friday and the atmosphere in the centre of the city of Birmingham.
Can I now move on to ask you about the legislation? A couple of days before the Birmingham bombs, you said in the House of Commons that on the best advice of the police and the army, banning the IRA, although it might understandably assuage certain feelings, nevertheless would make things more difficult for the security forces. And yet, a week later, after the Birmingham bombings, you suddenly announced that you were going to ban the IRA. Why did you change your mind so dramatically? Was it to assuage those feelings of public outrage that you'd mentioned?
I had always, it's perfectly true, that throughout the 8 months or whatever it was I had been Home Secretary, I had continued in the view which my predecessors in the last government had taken, on advice, that banning the IRA, while superficially attractive, was not likely to be effective. The police and security services had taken this view fairly strongly, but a little less strongly as time went on. I believe that the banning of the IRA, of the four main measures, one of the four main measures in the bill, was in a sense dealing with the problem of an affront to public feeling. Because I think that had the IRA been able to continue as a legal organization after Birmingham, this would have been so deeply offensive, and rightly offensive, to so many people in this country as to be perfectly intolerable.
You accept
and the police and the security services accepted that. But what I would say is that of the four measures in the bill, the banning of the IRA was the one most concerned with avoiding affronts to public feeling, though that's not an unreasonable approach. And the other three were directed to greatly strengthening the ability of the police and the security services to provide us with as much safety as possible.
Did the police or the security services specifically ask you for any particular measure which has now been passed? Did they come to you and say, we must have that power?
I don't think, no, they had not said that. We discussed the matter together. There are always difficulties about exactly what is, who advises a minister to do what, and indeed people don't want to have this happening. What I think is the case is that we moved broadly together on this, and I cannot remember any occasion when they were saying, we want more, and I'm saying you can't have it, or an occasion when I was saying, I want more, and they said, we don't want it. No, broadly we moved together, and the steps that I took were highly acceptable to the police and the security services, and were acceptable to Parliament in those circumstances, though they probably would not have been, almost certainly would not have been, because of the genuine issues of civil liberty which are raised previously.
Can I ask you a question that obviously concerns us greatly, which is that if in future I or any of my colleagues in television or in newspapers were to interview the IRA's David O'Connell or any other IRA member for that matter, under the new Act, would we be liable to prosecution?
Who is liable for prosecution is not a matter for the Home Secretary, it's a matter for the prosecuting authorities, who are the Director of Public Prosecution subject to the Attorney General, or for the police in minor cases. This is not just a verbal quibble, this is a very important part of our constitutional system. I don't tell people when they're going to be prosecuted. There was a great deal of debate about this in the House of Commons, and I'm very anxious to avoid a position in which I, as the Minister responsible for the Independent Broadcasting Authority and the BBC, get into a position of censoring either of these bodies and trying to make them subordinate to me. I believe in independent broadcasting in that sense. But I did indicate that, in my view, in the new circumstances, and this I believe would be the view of the authorities, a repeat of the O'Connell interview would be entirely inappropriate.
But would it necessarily be illegal?
That is a matter to be decided by the prosecuting authorities and by the courts. That is the fundamental principle of English law.
Can you then foresee circumstances in which journalists, and they may have to be special circumstances, are permitted to interview members of the IRA, to interview the enemy?
I think that the broadcasting authorities would be extremely foolish to do anything which gave the impression, as maybe that interview did to many people, but I don't pronounce on particular programs in the past, that they were in any way succouring an illegal and menacing organization so far as the people of this country are concerned.
Can I now ask you about the powers of arrest and detention? It appears that all the arrests that the police have made recently in connection with the bombings have been made without having had to have any recourse to the new measures, to the new powers which you have given them. If that's the case, why give them the powers in the first place?
I don't think you're right.
I actually quote police sources I've spoken to.
Well, I'm not sure what police sources you're quoting, but with respect, I do not think you're right. I think that, for instance, it has been necessary to hold people for the longer periods for which I have had to give authority in order that there might be the investigation of these offences. I don't say that everything, that all the arrests that have been made could not have taken place without the bill, without the act for a moment. What I do say is that the police had been working extremely hard before the act, that they were nearly in a position to do a number of things and achieve considerable successes, but that their position has been fortified by the act, and that the very considerable achievement from the point of view of police and detection work, so far as those who may have perpetrated these outrages are concerned, has been remarkably successful in the last fortnight, and that part of that, not the whole of it, is a result of the emergency powers.
What I'm really saying, Mr. Jenkins, is that it appears that in the past, if the police had needed to detain anybody for a rather important reason for a particular length of time, for example, the Price sisters, then they could always do it if necessary. So why give them specific powers when they could basically do what they wanted anyway?
Well, I think the police attach great importance to having these powers. They may have managed to find ways occasionally of doing things, but they were always at risk as to whether they were behaving properly. And I think that if the police are going to do things, and it is necessary for them to do this, it is much better that they should do it properly and clearly under Act of Parliament than by perhaps straining the powers that they have.
If a person is excluded and, say, sent back to Northern Ireland for suspected involvement in terrorism, isn't that person almost bound to be interned?
In many cases, he might well be interned. It does not inevitably follow that he would be interned. That would be a matter to be judged by the Northern Ireland authorities in relation to his behaviour in relation to Northern Ireland. It would not necessarily follow, but it might well in a number of cases.
In fact, it seems to me that there would be a strong likelihood of him being interned. If a man is sent out of this part of the United Kingdom for suspected terrorist activities, it's difficult to see him being allowed to run around Northern Ireland, having been sent out of this part of the United Kingdom for those reasons.
There might well be a likelihood.
In a sense, isn't the exclusion power really an alternative to building our own Long Kesh here in England?
No, I don't think so.
Aren't we using Northern Ireland as a dumping ground for the terrorists that we don't actually want in this part of the United Kingdom? So we're sending them back home again to Northern Ireland?
No, in certain cases, we can send people, of course, both to the Republic of Ireland and in certain cases to Northern Ireland. If they come from the Republic, they would be sent to the Republic and not to Northern Ireland. And there's also provisions in the bill to erect a ring fence around the United Kingdom, that's Northern Ireland as well as Great Britain, and enable Northern Ireland to use provisions of exclusion to the south. No, the question of building a Long Kesh here would not arise. I told the House of Commons, and I think this will be the case, that, no, let me finish the question if I may, please. That I told the House of Commons that I thought the numbers involved would be limited. I think they will be limited. I would not like to give the precise number, but will be totally disproportionate to any figure involved in Long Kesh. And anybody who is firmly established here for a very long time past cannot be sent back. But where people come over, whether from the Republic or from Northern Ireland, to commit, as it appears, acts of terrorism or to assist in them, I think it is reasonable that they should be sent back. I think we have to give the people of this country every protection we can.
If you deport a person, not to Northern Ireland, but say to the Republic, there is a chance, of course, that the Republic may try him for being a member of the IRA. It's perhaps even more likely that if that man is a terrorist, that he'll go back to Northern Ireland, which means that you have to intern him again. Or not you have to intern him, but Merlin Rees has to intern him, doesn't it?
If he does that, well, in the first place, he can be excluded from Northern Ireland if they can make the control effective, but there is a great...
But if he's a terrorist, Mr. Jenkins, they're going to intern him, aren't they? They're not going to say, go back home again to the south.
Oh, yes, if he is a terrorist who arrives from the south, I would think they would certainly intern him. Yes.
And if he arrives from the south, it's because he's arrived from this part of the United Kingdom.
Well, we have no powers of internment in this part of the United Kingdom, and I do not think that they would be called for in relation to the limited numbers involved. Northern Ireland has, in these circumstances, the special powers of internment which have developed in relation to the position in Northern Ireland, and one does not want any greater infringement of civil liberties than is essential for purposes of safety here. They also have the right to exclude him and to prevent him, if they can, crossing the border.
You say we have no powers of internment in this country, but it appears to me that under exclusion orders we don't need any powers of internment. If we wish to intern, we simply send them back to Northern Ireland.
Yes, we are dealing with a fairly limited number of people here.
But we're still interning them, Mr. Jenkins.
No, we are not. I'm sorry, you're contradicting yourself now. You said you don't have powers of internment. We do not have powers of internment.
In this part of the United Kingdom.
And in my view, we do not need and do not want to have powers of internment, which are under some criticism, though I think myself are justified, in Northern Ireland, where we are dealing with a limited number of people who come from an area in order to try and commit acts of terrorism in this country. I think it is sensible and reasonable to send them back. That is the protection which I think I owe to the people of this country and which I have endeavoured to carry out. But I do not think that it follows from this that it would be more sensible to have a mass internment policy here in order to deal with what I believe are a limited number of people and who can be dealt with effectively by the exclusion orders which we have made possible under the emergency legislation, which would not, of course, have been possible hitherto. A short time ago you were telling me that the emergency legislation did not, in your view, seem to be necessary. It is, in my view, clearly necessary on the questions you've just been asking me about the need to exclude them and the need to give the safety one can to people in this country.
What concerns a lot of people, Mr. Jenkins, and I'm sure it concerns a lot of people in Northern Ireland, is that what this legislation really does is say that there are two parts of the United Kingdom, and one of those parts, Northern Ireland, is treated differently to the rest of the United Kingdom, and that they see, perhaps unreasonably, that as being the thin end of the wedge, that perhaps it's the beginning of the road to withdrawal, the beginning of the road to independence. Surely you can understand those fears, can't you?
Yes, I can understand to some extent those fears. They were expressed during the debate. They were expressed by Enoch Powell, for instance, a new member for Northern Ireland, and I replied to them, and I think to some extent satisfied him. Mind you, what has to be borne in mind is that Northern Ireland, by its own choice, while part of the United Kingdom, has chosen for over 50 years past to be a rather separate part of the United Kingdom. And I told the House of Commons I passed innumerable bills as Home Secretary before as Chancellor of the Exchequer. None of them, by the choice of Northern Ireland, have applied to Northern Ireland.
But this legislation...
let me finish again. They have always maintained their system, their degree of independence, so far as that is concerned. They have always wished, under the 1922 Constitution, to be treated somewhat separately. And therefore to say that there is some difference of treatment is not a new thing. It has been something which has been there by the desire of Northern Ireland for a long time past. This does not mean that one wants to split the United Kingdom. It does not mean we have any intention at all, which I certainly have not, of giving in to terrorism. It does mean that one has to recognize certain realities and give every protection one can to the people of this island.
What also worries many people is that bombs go off in Birmingham, 21 people are killed, there is an emergency debate, and then there is emergency legislation. There is great, great concern. You say not panic, but there is certainly great concern that people would like to see the government devoting that same amount of concern and urgency to the problem of Northern Ireland, which after all is the cause of the problem at the moment, rather than just the symptoms. That what the legislation does is to attack the symptoms that we find, unfortunately, in our own country. And the government should direct its attention, the same urgency, to solving the cause, the problem of Northern Ireland.
Yes, you are right in saying that the ultimate solution, the ultimate way of removing the cancer of violence, must be a political solution in Northern Ireland. Must be to try and get people in Northern Ireland to live together in conditions of tolerance. But that is different from saying that we have failed to do this, or that successive governments have failed to do it through a sense of urgency.
Is the government
there's been a great deal of urgency which has been applied to it, but a solution has eluded people, and it is much easier in Northern Ireland to demand a solution, to call for a solution, than to say exactly what that solution should be. And if anybody knows exactly what that solution is, let him speak, because we will be very anxious to have his solution. We will endeavour to go on seeking with all the power we can, as Merlin Rees, my colleague, does, and other people have done before him, Willie Whitelaw and many others, to achieve a solution. But it is one thing to use all our efforts to get one, and in that extremely difficult position, to be sure you're going to get one. But that does not mean that it is not reasonable in the circumstances to try and prevent that difficulty so far as is humanly possible from spilling over into this island from whence it does not spring.
One last question, Mr. Jenkins. Can you say categorically, on behalf of the British government, that if there is a settlement in Northern Ireland, if there is peace, there will be no amnesty at all for political prisoners?
I have said firmly, I said in House of Commons last night, and I repeat it now, that I think that any terrorist who committed a crime of murder or maiming in this country and thought that he was going to be let out of prison as a result of any political change would be making a very grave mistake indeed. I don't recognize political excuses for the sort of bestial crimes which have been committed here recently.
Mr. Jenkins, thank you very much indeed. And that's all from This Week for tonight. Good night.